How many actors can truly say they've lived 1,000 lives on stage and screen? From playing with equal elan both Jawaharlal Nehru and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, from being the face of Colonel Sanders, to lending his voice to icons like Batman and Captain Planet, and being directed by Anis Bazmi, Abbas Mastan, Aryan Khan, and even Christopher Nolan along the way. That's a career most people can only dream of. But beyond all of that, the person I'm about to introduce is much, much more to me. My dear friend, and someone who has, like me, walked on the difficult but gratifying journey of sobriety. It's an honor to welcome you to the show, Denzel Smith.
My honor, Pooja. My honor.
Wow, that's a crazy body of work, I must say. How have you put all of this in and yet lived furiously and not only on the edge, but jumped off the edge pretty often in your life? And you're sitting in front of me, sober now, how many years?
14.
Wow.
Yeah. But how did I manage to do all this body of work? I have no idea myself. I have really no idea. But what I am really grateful about is being alive and having a few close friends and family and, just living. I thought I would die at 24. But I'm alive, yeah.
You're alive and kicking really hard. What's really fascinating is how when we first met, thanks to Ali Khan, our common friend and fellow actor, at our dear friend Gitanjali Kurian's house.
Yes.
And we used to have those crazy days and nights where we would play Risk.
Yeah.
And talk about everything from divinity to death. I think me and you didn't quite like each other initially.
Not really.
Yeah. Because we were both very big personalities.
We were big. Not only that, I would, at that time, in my intoxicated state, be rather brash. I was rather brash and very forthcoming.
Very forthcoming.
To put it mildly.
Yeah, to put it mildly.
But I think it was the intoxicants.
It was the
intoxicants. Because I wasn't such a nice person actually then. Inside of me, I think I have grown ever since I've sorted out my issues. Yeah, and in some ways, acting has been really therapeutic for me, especially the theatre. And it has helped me grow. And it is important, I think, for any human being to delve inside, because we have a lot of crap that we grow up with.
But we bury a lot.
Yeah, we bury a lot. Bury it, and a lot of childhood things and which we ignore, which leave indelible impressions on our video screens. Yeah. So it is necessary to go back and look at all that.
Yeah.
And then sort yourself out. Of course, it's a long journey. It never really ends.
No, but talking about childhood, you have a fascinating background. I mean, your father was a customs officer and a musician.
Yeah.
And especially that beautiful relationship you developed with this French boy called Jean, who you met thanks to your father.
So Jean-Christophe Boulard is an amazing story. Because my father used to sing with the Paranjoti Academy Chorus. He had a great love for Western classical music, in fact, all kinds of music. And he was LTCL, Trinity College. It was one of his hobbies, which gave him great solace from the government job he had.
He was an upright officer.
He was. Mentioned. If he was corrupt, I wouldn't have had this struggle. So he had gone touring with the Paranjoti Academy Chorus in 1965, I think it was, 66. And they went to about 30 countries and 60 cities, singing. And they were performing at all the very renowned opera houses around. And that time, they had no money. I think they got £10 or something like that as allowance. They were put up by local classical music societies all over the world, and people, hosted them. So at one such place in Tours in France, He was hosted by a doctor, Pierre Boulard. When he walked into this house, there was this little boy who was about my age then. And he was waiting eagerly at the door because his father told him there's an Indian coming to see him. And he saw my father in a suit and tie and just burst out crying. And my father was like aghast. Why is this little boy upset at seeing me? Dr. Boulard explained to my dad that he was expecting an Indian with feathers, and he was rather appalled, and upset seeing a man in a suit and a tie. Then my dad made friends with him, and when he came back, my dad told me that this boy is exactly like you. He asks a lot of questions. I've given him our address, and he will write to you. You must correspond with him. And promptly he did write to me. And we started this pen pal thing. Correspondence, yeah. Where he would pour his heart out in French. He would write letters in French. My dad would translate them for me.
Wow.
And I would write in English and his father would translate the letters. Until he was sent to Ireland to a boarding school so that he could learn English because his father wanted him to be a doctor. Then he started writing in broken English. That was much later. So that's how this correspondence began. And then I was touring in 2011 with a show, and I was in tour. So I told the manager of the company, I said, man, I got to find out this guy. He's a doctor now, Dr. Jean-Christophe Boulard. We were pen pals, and I know his address. Snail mail,
Right.
writing. I knew the
Right.
address. He's saying, don't worry, I'll find him for
And
you.
there was an amazing detail where he would send you used pencils. In the letters that he would write you, he would include this gift of pencils.
I never understood why. And then I met him, and he asked me to sign the brochure of the play that I was doing. And I took out my Mont Blanc. And I was signing it, and he looked at it and said, wow, you now sign with a Mont Blanc. And I used to send you those pencils because I thought in India people were poor and they didn't have pencils and rubbers. So all my half-used pencils, I would send them in letters.
Oh, that's amazing. That letter was so moving because you lost your father when you were very young. And you wrote to him and you said, I've lost my translator.
So after we met, when I met him in 2011, after this manager tracked him, his mother actually came. His mother came to the show, and she was a little wary of this whole story that I told, about my father. Yeah, I'll give him your contact, etc. She didn't really give me his number. But she finally did give him my number, and he called me whilst I was in France, and we had this amazing catch-up for 2 hours. My God, it was so emotional, I can't tell you. So then he said to me, I have kept all your letters. I have all of them.
Wow.
And particularly this one I remember, and he quoted some lines from that letter. I said, wow, you remember? He's saying, yes, and I'll send you back the letters. And he sent me all the letters. And I can't tell you, those letters were written, maybe I was about 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, around that time. And this particular letter was informing him of my father's passing away.
Yes.
And when he sent me back this letter quite recently, I can't tell you what a healing it was for me to read that. Because it took me back into that state of mind.
To the little boy you were.
To the little boy I was and the grief I felt then. And it really healed a lot. Yeah.
That's so beautiful because, today in this day and age, Denzel, I just find that people talk about intimacy, but they do not know what the other person's handwriting is like.
Yeah.
And this is so magical because I feel if you don't know someone's handwriting, how do you truly know them?
Absolutely. Talking about the healing that it did for me, I realized there was a resentment I had.
When you lost your father?
Yeah. And I held that resentment against him.
You felt abandoned.
So it was a resentment towards a dead person.
Right.
Who was gone many years,
Yeah.
And I didn't realize it for a long, long time. But to add to that, recently, his mother passed away, Jean-Christophe. And he went back to the family home and he found all the letters that my father had written to his father and mother. And he sent me back those letters. So I got a greater insight into my father's state of mind at that time in the 60s. I still have those letters with me. I got to know my dad through those letters.
Yeah. You recently lost the dearest person in your life, your mother. I'll never forget how she looked at me and I was wearing red. It was Easter and she said, "I like your red. Wear more red." And she would wear this slash of red lipstick all the time. And believe me, every time I see anything red in my closet now, it reminds me of her. So I think that for the rest of my life, I'm going to be wearing red in honor of her. And you moved back into her home, a home you grew up in.
Yep.
And I remember you telling me that, besides the living memories of her, there's so much that you've experienced within that home, whether it was falling into addiction, getting sober, relapsing, getting sober again. And you said every corner, every tile, every nail has a memory. Said the walls scream, you said. How is that? How are you feeling now?
It keeps coming back. Yes, just yesterday, actually, I was thinking about it when I was in the toilet there. And of all how many hours I used to lock myself in there and do lots of nonsense. Pooja, the day you came, and that was just a few days before she passed away, was one of the last few times she really smiled and talked.
She wanted me to sit by her side.
Yeah, and she was smiling. I remember that smile when she saw you and she said, nice red.
Yeah. I remember when you propped her up and you tied her hair into a ponytail. And it was such an intimate moment and I'm so privileged to have been in the room at that time. I really wanted to take a photo, but I didn't want to intrude. But now I just wish I did. Because the two of you sitting side by side, you just were like a mini version of her. And I think that's where you get your spirit from. I mean, she was 94 years old.
Yeah, she was. Some parts of her life were very difficult, which I contributed to.
But she loved you.
She loved me a lot, but and that's what saved me, actually.
Yeah.
It saved me. She never gave up. The whole world gave up on me. When I was in the depths of despair. She never gave up. And I had caused a lot of grief during my difficult days.
Yes.
But I was glad that I was able to make it up to her.
Oh, you did. I'm witness to that.
And make amends.
Yes.
Yeah. Which I am so grateful for. And the latter half of her life, she lived rather comfortably. And she was happy. Losing a parent later in life, I think, is far more difficult. When you're young, you brush it aside and it's there at the back of your mind, but you don't really...
Do you have other things that
you occupy yourself with? When you lose a parent when you're older, it's far more difficult.
I can't even imagine. I guess you never know until you feel that loss.
And however much you prepare yourself for it, it's still there. And it's a grief which stays with you. It will stay with you and one has to accept that. But one is grateful for having had such lovely, caring parents. Yeah.
But the grief, Denzel, do you think that as actors, as entertainers, we harness that and we tend to mine it? And that also does help. But then you walk around holding on to these emotions that you tap into and put back into use when you are in front of a camera. And that is really where the trouble begins, because we do tend to carry this weight around because it's emotional arsenal in that sense. And as actors, we are meant to have this access to our emotions. But is it a business that incubates addiction in that sense? Because when you do a show, when you do a film, you want the audience to get addicted to it. We ourselves are in a position where the highs are tremendous. And then the lows are what they are. And I remember you were such a great help to me when Bombay Begums released in 2021. And you were the only one who called me at that time and said, Pooja, watch it. This is when you need to be careful because you are on the path of sobriety. And you said that it's when you touch the highs, when the movie is a hit, when the show is a hit, when the bank balance is full, that's when you could slip. And that was such sage advice.
You know, Pooja, for people like you and me, and for many others, we have to treat success and failure both as imposters.
Yes. Yes.
That is how I begin to look at it now. Yeah. They're both imposters.
Right.
Because both can bring you down completely. Looking at pain as a tool, as an act for an actor that you talked about. Yeah, it's what they call in different schools of acting, emotional memory. Now that can be useful, where you draw upon experiences from your childhood or the
Correct.
past. Yeah. Initially, you pull out those whole experiences and transfer them into a character or into
Right.
the context of the script. But later on, it becomes a technique. It's craft. Now, this craft, I remember very early when I used to do theatre, and my very good friend, I used to spend a lot of time with him, and in his house actually, Javed Jafri,
Yes, Javed Jafri.
and his father, Ishtiaq Uncle, whom we all know as Jagdeep. I used to spend a lot of time with Jagdeep Uncle. Javed and me were friends, but I would not spend time with Javed in Javed. I would sit and chat with Uncle.
Right.
And for hours, he would tell me his stories. He used to tell me about how he grew up on the Baikala Bridge with his mother when he came to Bombay as a child. We were talking about acting. If I recall now, my first acting lessons were him. I said, how do you cry and this and that? He said, just look at me. Stare into my eyes. And I just looked at him, and within 1 second, he had tears streaming. I said, how did you do that? Saying, just my past, my memories of my childhood and the difficult times I had. I just have to recall that. And zap, he was just weeping. I said, wow, that is technique.
This whole simple exercise of sitting down and looking into each other's eyes, actually looking, not pretending to look. Then you connect with the person there and you realize that, hey, we are the same.
Yeah.
And that connection is actually so moving. But that's exactly what we are always running away from.
Absolutely. This running away, I feel, is now being facilitated by technology.
It's actually drawing us further away from each other.
Drawing further away from each other. And we have that eye contact that you talk about. Yeah. There is a generation I know of young kids who are awkward in the presence of other people, but when they are online, they
Right.
communicate fully.
That's very true. Both
Yeah,
you and me grew up in a Bandra where there were no phones.
Exactly.
But
where
yet
you-
we reached everywhere on time.
Absolutely.
And you knew exactly where to find the next drink or the next kind of party.
And you know where your friends were in the evening.
Yeah, and you never
And
showed up late to
connected-
work.
Yeah. It was a different era.
But how different is Bandra? Do you remember that time? It was Dalip Tahil's birthday.
Yes.
And we ended up back at his home, which is, I think, two
Somewhere
buildings away
Pali.
from where we're sitting and recording right
A
now.
little further down the road.
Though I
yeah.
must admit, I know the area, but I have very blurry memories of what building exactly, thanks to all the whiskey I imbibed. And me and you decided to walk back home at some 4 in the morning.
Yeah.
And we walked from Pali Hill all the way to, Reclamation. And you gave me a running commentary on every home. Every lane you had a story. You were like, in this bungalow, this used to happen, and so lived there. And this is where we hung out, and this was Needle Park. I just felt that I was walking through time. That night is so vivid, or that morning rather. You should actually see Bandra through the eyes or relive Bandra through the eyes of Denzel Smith. Because you have so many memories.
Yeah, one grew up here, I mean, one grew up in this quaint little town. It's unique.
Yeah.
It's a unique place in the whole of India where we have
melting pot.
a melting pot. It's a unique subculture.
Yeah.
Subculture of a subculture, you might say.
Correct.
Where it was predominantly Christian at that time, but it wasn't really Christian in that sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, in its mores and things like that. Because we had everybody living here. There were Muslims, Hindus, Parsis, Sindhis, everybody.
And it really didn't matter who was what.
It didn't matter to us
At all.
at
That's so
all
true.
in school.
Yeah.
Who was who? We were all one.
Yeah.
My greatest education, I tell you, was having boys in my class who drove up in Mercedes Benzes and boys who came to school without chappals.
Correct.
Yeah. I think navigating those two sides, those two extremes, those friendships,
Yeah.
is what my education is all about.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. That I was able to, talk to, have friends from there and have friends from there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in anything in between. That was the real education, I think. And which most of our schools in Bandra had.
Yeah.
I don't know if it still exists.
But we meet still on the same, we connect on that same level. I mean, no matter where somebody has reached in life or no matter how far back they might have fallen supposedly by the standards of the world, when one meets, you connect and you take off from where you left off.
Right.
And which is why there's so much of emphasis on seniority, not only in terms of career or in terms of age, but in terms of people who had more life experiences than you.
Yeah.
And you valued those life experiences.
That's where I am.
Yeah.
There is so much more to do.
There is much more to do for all of us.
Yeah. And we're running out of time.
We're running out of time.
Yeah.
You're going to be around telling stories at 94, much like my favorite character you ever played was, the lead in Bombay Jazz. In fact, one of my favorite plays, one that you produced,
Right.
about the jazz scene.
Yeah.
And also, interestingly, about Hindi film music.
Right.
And the connection between the two and how much jazz was actually incorporated and inculcated and used.
Yeah.
And most of us know the tunes and know the song, but we do not really know the history.
Yeah.
So how did Bombay Jazz happen?
I was at a talk at Prithvi Theatre one Sunday morning where Girish Karnad was in conversation with Mahesh Dattani. And in the interval of that, I was sitting outside in the cafe and I met an old friend, Ramu Ramanathan, who's a writer and also was in the theatre. We were having a little chat and I had just come across Naresh's and Jerry's article, a little short story called Morning You Play Different, Evening You Play Different.
I love that.
And I was really impressed. Since my dad's connection also with music and he had friends who were musicians, etc., I found that subject very interesting of Goan and Anglo-Indian musicians in Bombay and them performing.
I mean, they were the lifeblood of the Hindi film music scene.
At that time, the live clubs which were there, and lots of clubs, Venice and Talk of the Town, etc. And I said, Ramu, sure, why don't we do a play on this? So he said, I don't know anything about jazz, but will you help me? I said, sure, I'll help you. And I approached Naresh and said, give me all the research that you've done on this subject. Then Ramu said, no, this is not enough. I need to talk to people. And I had friends who were the children of some of these musicians. So I said, Ramu, chalo, I'll fix interviews with these people. Let's go. And we started going around the city and meeting these musicians or their families and talking to them, in the course of which they brought out family albums, etc. So we looked at some pictures and then that would trigger, that was there and this was that, and that would trigger another story. And Ramu got a wealth of information and I got a wealth of pictures because I carried along a portable scanner and scanned all the pictures. But the point which the play makes to a certain extent is that these were musicians who contributed greatly to, I won't say Bollywood, I don't like that word.
Well, for lack of a better term, it's a Hindi film industry.
Hindi film music.
Yes.
The Hindi film music between say, the late 30s, 40s
Yeah.
to 1980. Their contribution was invaluable. Yeah. And many of the tunes, and they had a lot of these, they were exposed to a lot of Western music and jazz, and they brought these influences into Hindi music.
Yeah, I mean, so many songs that people just sing because they've been hearing it since they were children.
Yeah.
And when they listen to it again, after they see the context, I mean, I've seen so many people who I brought to watch Bombay Jazz, and they were like, oh my God, Ina Mina Dika. We know that song. Even about Anthony Gonsalves, I think you should tell that story.
Anthony Gonsalves was quite a genius. He was Lakshmikant's music teacher, and subsequently also the arranger for those fabulous background scores, which are like concertos, actually.
Right.
If you listen to them,
Yes.
they're like Western classical concertos. And that was all arranged by Anthony Gonsalves. In fact, that song, My Name
is Anthony Gonsalves. I mean,
That's-
who has not sung that song at some point?
That's a tribute to him.
Unbelievable.
That's a tribute to him. They used his name.
And he recently passed away, you said.
Yeah, he passed away in Goa in his 90s. He's still giving violin lessons at 10 rupees. Died a bachelor.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. I think he was the first guy who did fusion music. This concept of fusion
Right.
of Indian and Western music.
Yes.
Yeah. So you might say these were the pioneers. He was, in fact, the pioneer of what we call today fusion
Right.
music. Yeah.
So you're saying the point that the play really was making is that their contribution was immense, but they went unsung.
They went unsung and died in penury.
So from advertising, you fell into acting.
Yeah, I was always interested in acting, and I just got drawn to it, and I was doing it since school and college. But I never really thought about being an actor professionally living in India. Because firstly, my first language is not Hindi. We spoke
Yeah.
English at home.
Correct.
My Hindi in Bandra extended to right jao, left jao, ye le aao, wo jao, idhar karo, udhar karo. Yeah.
Bombaya Hindi
Yeah,
and Bandra
Bombaya
Hindi is a
Hindi.
different.
Yeah,
It's a different category of
So, and besides, I grew up on a diet of Western films, We didn't really watch, although we lived in Bandra and saw all the stars all around us all the time.
Yeah, and it was no big deal.
But it was no big deal. It was a part of life, yeah.
Right.
Hey, Rajesh Khanna there, Raja walking on Carter Road. Yeah, these 100 girls are screaming. What are they screaming for in front of Ashirwad? Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. I would like to have been an actor, but I said, what am I going to do? Theatre? Yeah. So I indulged in theatre and English theatre. And it never paid. It doesn't even pay for, even till today, it doesn't even pay for your toilet paper. Yeah.
And your first film was with Rajiv Rai.
Yeah.
And that's a fascinating story. I remember you telling me that you had just kind of cleaned up and you wanted to get out of town for a while. And Rajiv Rai was doing this movie that he was shooting in Scotland.
Right. And I said, Rajiv, give me a part here in this film because I need to get out. I had just got clean
Yes.
at that time. And I wanted to go abroad. I think I was in love with a woman that time who was traveling, who was also traveling to London.
Okay. So that was...
That was the motivation.
Right.
And I wanted to go and I had no money to buy a ticket. Rajiv, yaar, mere ko part de, yaar.
Any
Mere ko
part
jana
will
hai.
do.
Any part will do, yaar. You think, but there's no part for you, yaar. There's nothing. So, finally, I convinced him. And I said, "Theek hai, I'll make you the heroine's brother." So I said, "Chalo yaar, heroine ka bhai banta hai."
So you land up in Scotland.
I landed up in Scotland, in Glasgow. And then I get a call from Rajiv. He said, "Denzel, we need you to do a look test." So I said, "Look test? Yeah. No, there's another part which I want you to play. I need you to look older. And I went down and the makeup people came and they put on a moustache and grade me and this, that and all that. I said, okay, you're playing the heroine's father now. So I said, yeah, great. So what had happened was that there was a
senior actor
who
was meant to play that
part, who was boarding the flight the previous night to come there and got smashed at Bombay airport and was boarded the flight completely smashed out of his head and was creating a scene on the flight and was storming up and down the aisle and all that, and the crew got very hassled and the pilot aborted the takeoff and brought the flight back to the terminal and offloaded. Said, I cannot take off. This is a security risk. I cannot take off. Right? So he was offloaded from the flight and the shoot had to go on. So they cast me.
This is hilarious.
That was my debut in Hindi films.
So look at it, it's crazy. I mean, there you were on the sober path, and thanks to somebody else who gets unhinged completely.
Yeah.
And alcohol is at play there too.
Exactly.
You land your first major part in a Hindi film.
Absolutely.
Wow, that's one hell of a story, Mr. Smith. So we were talking earlier about the movies that you've done and the directors you worked with, and Anis Bazmi, Abbas Mastan, to Christopher Nolan.
Nolan is an intense guy and highly secretive.
Secretive in terms of what?
They don't reveal anything of the script to you, and even nothing is revealed. And in fact, when you get your sides, you are sitting with two executives and one AD in a closed room where you signed 3-4 NDAs and then you are briefed and then you are given just your scene.
Oh, so you're not given a script in entirety?
No.
Is he a very precise director?
He's a very precise director. In fact, he knows exactly what he wants and shoots exactly that. The scale of that production was just something else. And the professionals involved are all top-notch Hollywood. And it was, at that time, it was the most expensive Hollywood film ever produced of that year. It was $450 million.
Oh God.
Fabulous budget.
But even Delhi Crime, you were so good in Delhi Crime. And you mentioned that the DOP was brilliant and how he would shoot with available light. And by the time Shefali went off to do a costume change, he'd already knocked off 2 portions of your...
I cut into my salary by doing that. We used to sit down. And Richie Mehta is a delight to work with and a fabulous director. He was also very clear about what he wants. And we would wait while Shefali went to the van to change, because the van had to be parked a little away at a distance from the location, and came back. It would be a clean 45 minutes to an hour. And I would be sitting and faffing with Richie on the set. And I would change my clothes on the set. I said, I'm not going back,
That's the old school training, na?
He said, there's this small scene here. You think you can do it? Knock it off. I said, yeah, give me 15 minutes. I'll just learn the line. Yeah, and Johan, the camera guy, was ready. Yeah, I'm ready. And with his minimal lighting technique, and he would just put the camera and shoot, and we would take it. And by the time Shefali would come, this became a habit. And soon Richie later said that because of you and doing all these scenes in between this, I advanced my schedule by 3 days.
So you lost out on your per day then?
Yes, I lost out on my per day.
Yeah, and you were shooting with Abbas Mastan during COVID. And you described to me the set.
Well, that was scary.
And
that was scary.
Put it mildly, because there was all this kind of, you have to follow the norms and distance, and then there were 300 junior artists on that set.
There were 300,
And then what they said? Break.
And then they said pack up.
They said pack up, the magic word.
Magic word, pack up. And everybody ran like dogs left from a leash. Towards one small entrance to get out of there. And man, I just stood there. I said, man, now what? And I I said, okay, even if half an hour later, I'm fine. I'm not going to run. And it was scary indeed. Yeah. But this was during COVID. Yeah, we were shooting.
From somebody who said, all I knew of Hindi was right jao, left jao. You're pretty entrenched in the Hindi film industry. We shot together for a film called Pop.
Yes.
My first film as a director.
Yes.
And we went to Spiti.
Wow.
Took us 18 hours to drive from,
oh my God.
from
That was
Manali to Kaza.
Scary drive.
There were no roads.
There were no roads.
You and Dr. Agashe were in the
Me
same
and
car.
Dr. Agashe, and I think John also was in it.
Was John in it as well?
Yeah. Because I remember him almost holding my hand and saying, we're going to die. And there was that generator van took 3 days to come.
I'll never forget when I drove over this one particular hill and I saw at a distance the generator van, Denzel, and it looked like a little toy van. And that's when it hit me. I said, what have I done? I bought like 180 people into unknown terrain. Nobody had ever shot in that part of India before.
Ever shot there before.
And I said, oh my God, I'm responsible for all of these people and their lives because we were shooting at 18,500 feet and really high altitude.
Yes. And Dr. Mohan Agashe and me played cards for 5 days continuously where I lost a lot of money. I remember that.
And you were playing this monk called Lama Norbu.
Yes, which was the only time in my life
when you shaved your head.
I shaved my head. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, I've never shaved my head after that or before that. Yeah. What an experience that was. I tell you, it was a spiritual experience actually for me because being in the presence of all those beautiful, enormous, gigantic mountains, and one felt so small.
Yeah, that's true.
Infinitesimally small.
Yeah.
And the greatness of nature and the force of nature really hit me then because we spent more than a month there.
More than a month there.
It was glorious.
Talking about coming face to face with nature and, how minuscule you feel in the face of it, it reminds me of COVID. When we were both holed up in our individual homes in the country.
Wow.
And that cyclone hit.
What a time.
And you called me and you said, my door has just been blown off and my roof is shaking. And there was this entire situation in India at that time with the tragic demise of Sushant Singh Rajput.
Yes.
It was such a dark time because the industry was being, pulled into the abyss, really. And there was this boycott Bollywood trend that was happening.
That was a very schemed, planned attack.
I remember talking to you about this and saying that, Denzel, if they're going to be criminalizing the act of imbibing any sort of substance, don't you think it's going to take all the work that's been done in the realm of recovery into the dark ages? I know that you are actively involved. You take meetings, you sponsor people, and you're an advocate for AA, and you work closely with even Kripa Foundation, what Father Joe has set up and run so successfully for 40 plus years now. And I remember asking you, I said, if somebody wants to seek help at this point with the discourse in the country where they dumb down everything with regards to mental health, substance abuse, addiction, recovery, will people actually seek help? Because we do know for a fact that during COVID, a lot of people develop drinking problems.
Addiction is a disease.
Yeah.
And it should be looked upon as any other disease.
As a moral failing, it's looked upon, but
it is looked as upon moral failing as a criminal offense. When it is actually a disease. Until that mindset changes in India, and we have to make every attempt to change that.
Yeah.
And spread the word that this is a disease. It's not. There's nothing wrong. They're not bad people. Addicts are not bad people.
Absolutely.
Or alcoholics are not bad people. They just have a disease. They have a problem. And that problem can be addressed. There is AA, there is NA.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is the same program actually. It's the 12-step program. And it's the best program that is available. People seek spiritual help, psychiatric help. Different kinds of help is available for addiction. But there's it's unparalleled. The therapeutic value of one addict helping another or one alcoholic helping another is without parallel.
But like, for example, Denzel, I didn't go to AA. Not that I feel superior that I didn't, but I had a living example in my home called Mahesh Bhatt, and I chose to make the world my AA class. So I spoke about it loudly because that kept me on course, you know. But I did go to an NA class, which you were chairing, and I was so struck by the lack of judgment in that room and the demographic, actually. And I realized that basically what people are lacking within their own homes is the ability to be able to really be emotionally bare with each other. And that's what these classes actually give you. So I think that a lot of people do not even know that help is available. And also what I found fascinating was, like COVID, which didn't look at your bank balance or what sex you are or how old you are. It just infected your being.
Yeah.
When you're sitting in a room full of addicts, you see people from different backgrounds, totally different social strata, age groups, but what is the same is the dependency. When I first decided to quit alcohol, I did realize that a lot of people didn't want to hang out with me anymore because I somewhere became a reminder to them that they had a problem. And they were like, oh, you're not fun anymore. You don't laugh as much anymore. Come on, have one drink for me. If you love me, you'll have a drink. It's my anniversary, have a drink. It's my birthday, one drink. I can't drink alone, give me company. And somebody very close to me, I think I was a reminder to them that they had a problem. And I got into a situation where the conversation became pretty toxic, and I was told, great line though, that get out of my house with your halo of sobriety. And I decided to put distance between myself and that person. And I remember reaching out to you and saying that I'm feeling guilt-ridden for wanting to cut off, because at this point I think that this journey I'm on is most important and nothing can come in the way. And you told me something that really changed it all for me. And you said, Pooja, it was a selfish illness and it's an even more selfish recovery. Anybody or anything that gets in your way or gives you the feeling that, hey, you might stumble because they are, triggering something within you, distance yourself from. And when you've healed, then revisit that.
Yeah.
Because you will heal and you'll be able to handle that.
Then you become selfless.
Yes.
Yes.
So I must say thank you to you. Because, I hold on to guilt. I'm a Piscean, grown up in Bandra with the Christian sense of faith and belief. Guilt is our life. So at every point, even when you're recovering, you want to put the other first. But it takes time to adjust to the fact that, hey, you got to put yourself first. And only if you heal yourself can you be of any use to anybody in your life.
Absolutely. See, guilt and shame are two things which are not required.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one has to heal oneself from that and get rid of all guilt and shame and examine that which gives you guilt and shame.
Yeah.
Another thing is, especially where alcohol is concerned, it's such a socially accepted drug.
Absolutely, it's everywhere.
It is the oldest drug known to man.
Yes.
And is so socially acceptable that people do not see the addiction creeping up, and it takes a long time to catch up with you. I always say, eternal vigilance is the price we pay. And as a part of that eternal vigilance, one has to be selfish at times.
Yes.
One is too many and 1,000 never enough.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
For people like us. There are other people who can have 2 drinks in the night. And stop.
Yeah, we don't have a full stop.
We don't have a full stop, yeah. That's the disease.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people have also told me this, that, why do you choose to go through life calling yourself an alcoholic? You never had to be picked out of the gutter, or you never kind of made an ass of yourself in that sense. And my response is simple. I said, I'd rather go through life calling myself an alcoholic and remain sober than go through life drunk and fool myself and tell myself that I'm not. A lot of people also say that, don't keep referring to yourself as an addict, or don't refer to yourself as an alcoholic, because then that becomes your definition, really. But I don't look at it like that. I think that the stigma needs to go. And if by our speaking out, if there is one person out there who feels that, hey, if they could do it, then we can too. Because we drank. Then we pushed it to the limit.
The bottom line of everything, if I accept that I have a problem,
Yeah,
then
the acceptance.
then I can do something about it. The first step is accepting that you have a problem and that your life is unmanageable. Now, that is a question mark. People say, my life is manageable. I've got a job. I'm holding a job. I've never begged for anything. I've not got into any trouble.
Right.
I've not... but your life is unmanageable. If you examine it properly, your emotions are unmanageable. Everything is unmanageable. And you're using as a substance or your drug of choice to manage.
The business that we've chosen to be in, Denzel, it's high stress. There's so much of pressure all the time to constantly deliver, to constantly be that money-making machine for people, deliver on a superhuman level, where the frailties and the humanness actually is meant to be put on the back burner. And somewhere it's a culture also. I'm not saying that it's not there in the corporate world and everywhere else. I'm talking about mainly about our business. It becomes something to take the edge off at the end of a long day. It becomes something that you celebrate with. You say, okay, my movie is not worked, let's have a drink, you'll feel better. And a lot of people who come into the business also who might not imbibe find themselves slowly becoming part of this culture. It's a business of highs. Eventually the audience, they're addicts. They need to consume that music, the play, the entertainment that you're doling out. You want them to be addicted to you and to the work that you churn out. And we ourselves are addicted to that feeling of, when you're on stage and you've given a great performance and the human contact and the audience is giving you their response live. That's what theatre does for you, right?
Yeah.
But there's no manual that teaches you how to deal with the silences. Those long spells of the phone not ringing. Like loss, for example. We've both lost so many friends along the way. That's why when people say, oh, you've aged, I'm like, it's a privilege to age. Because we have so many people who we've lost really young in their lives. True. In school, they don't teach you about how to cope with loss. They don't teach you about how to cope with grief. It's a world that just says, achieve, achieve, achieve.
Yeah.
And alcohol delivers. Society fails. Alcohol delivers. And COVID. I wouldn't have been able to go through COVID if I was still drinking. I was able to tune in and deal with the uncertainty that we were all plunged into because I had decided to walk on this path of sobriety. Right. Because then you got to sit with your pain.
Yourself, yeah.
And sit with what it was that you were running away from. And all the uncomfortable things rise. And then you got to kind of lock horns with it. Tame your demons. Make them into friendly ghosts.
That's what it's all about. It's all about looking at yourself. And if you're able to sit with yourself without doing anything, with just the silence, and be comfortable with that silence, I think that is bliss.
Yeah.
The problem is that the world does not allow you to do that. Yeah? Or you don't allow yourself because you have access to so many things to run away with.
Yeah.
And you're running away continuously. You're not processing all the emotions that you're going through. And then you think you're getting away from everything by having a drink or by having getting high.
So anything that you do to escape discomfort and that gives you temporary relief.
Yeah. Now people, to escape their discomfort, become workaholics.
Of course, workaholism. I mean,
they become,
social media addiction, gambling addiction, love and sex addiction.
Love and sex. There are several. Food. Big one. Some people inject rupees into their bank accounts to escape. And some people inject heroin.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
everyone's addicted to something.
Everybody addicted to realize that. Accept the fact that to do something, not to be running away from.
Yourself.
To do it for the sake of, for you liking to do it. And to be able to still be able to have an identity and be yourself without doing anything, not because of this work that I've achieved or that fame I've achieved.
Right. There's a you beyond all of that.
That is me. Yeah.
Okay, I think you said it because, I mean, a lot of people try to simplify for me and say, oh, is this a consequence of the fact that you came from a broken home?
Yeah.
Or, I'm like, no. You forget that I went through the most traumatic phase of my life, and that phase was fame happening to me at the age of 19.
Absolutely.
And by the time I was 20, I was probably on everyone's wall.
Absolutely.
And then by the time you're 21, you're like, is this it? I mean, I was a Bandra girl, like you said. We grew up never taking ourselves too seriously. I've been very lucky. I've got these movies and I've made this money and I've traveled the world and people, I'm filling up, stadiums and there are 1.5 lakh people screaming out your name.
And
then you're like,
heady.
so what?
That can be heady.
Yeah, it's heady, but then you're like, so what?
Yeah.
Is this it?
Absolutely.
So it was really the vacuousness of that.
Yeah.
That made me want to escape. I said, there has to be more to life.
Yeah.
And then, of course, when I stumbled onto filmmaking, I felt a certain sense of gratification. I felt that, my self-esteem actually came back at that time when I stepped away from the spotlight. Not while I was I was very reluctant. I was a reluctant star. And today when I come back to acting, I do so with gratitude and much more understanding because of the fact that I've been away from it and I've made films so I can understand the process and respect the process more, so I have more patience. But because of sobriety.
Yeah.
Where I'm able to just be comfortable in my own skin. And it's taken me so long to realize that the answers do not lie anywhere else.
Comfortable in your own skin.
In my own skin, with myself.
Yeah.
And that, I always looked for home. And it took me so long to realize that I am my home.
Yeah.
I am home.
It's an inside job more than an outside job.
So very often I've just, it might sound really corny, but I've actually patted myself and say, hey, thank you.
Yeah.
To this vessel called this body for carrying me for this long. So I think COVID was traumatic in many ways, but also so liberating.
Yeah.
And it brought me closer to myself.
It allowed you that.
Yeah.
But it worked in the reverse for many others.
It did.
So many people killed themselves.
Yes.
So many relationships got
Families broke up. Because they were just not used to being in the same room for so long.
Exactly. Yeah. Eventually one has to realize that my identity is not my car, not the clothes I wear, not my fame. What is my true identity inside of me? Yeah. And one comes to terms with that or realizes that or sees that, then I think one is at peace with the world and with oneself. And when one is at peace with oneself, one is at peace with the world.
That's true. That's true. I mean, the real battles you're actually fighting are within.
Are within. We are our worst enemies, most of us.
When you enter a program, they actually advise you not to get involved with somebody for the first year or two.
Yeah.
Can you explain why?
Sex. It can trigger.
Right.
Trigger you all over again. And then this intense feeling of what we call love sometimes is misinterpreted.
Right. So you're saying that the fix that you got from the bottle,
you transfer it onto something.
And you use that person then to give you that high.
Yeah, to get you that high and to get that fix. And if that fix is not there or breaks away from you, you go through immense pain and you can't handle that pain and you go back to your addiction.
Right.
Yeah.
So whether you use a person or you use a substance.
Yeah.
It's addiction.
It's addiction.
And you got to stay away from that.
Yeah. So just as you have Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, there's also something called Sex Anonymous.
Yes.
And that's why they advise in the first, if you've been single, not to get into a relationship.
But before we move away from addiction, I think an important thing to drive home is that I remember asking my father when he hit 25 years of sobriety, that, Papa, you've been sober 25 years. You can have a drink now. And he said, no, I cannot. Because one drop, and I'm back in the gutter.
Exactly.
Couldn't understand it, Denzel, until I got on this path myself.
One is too many and 1,000 never enough.
Absolutely. So this thing of, oh, but Denzel, you've been sober 14 years or 20 years, and Pooja, now you're almost a decade. That means you've recovered.
You recovered. Yeah.
So that,
We have to understand that we have an allergy.
absolutely.
It's an allergy.
I don't process it like you would.
Yes, it's an allergy towards substances, to your drug of choice or towards whatever substance.
True. And if you walk into someone's house and you tell them that, I'm allergic to seafood, say, for example,
Yeah.
they would not force you to eat it.
Exactly.
But if you say, I'm allergic to alcohol, they say, have one, nothing will happen.
Yeah. They won't accept it. Yeah. It's an allergy. And you have to accept that you have an allergy.
But do you think the government needs to do more?
I think the judiciary has to be educated on this subject, especially because a lot of criminal offenses that are committed or people arrested are because of addiction or alcoholism.
So they should be going to a program and not to jail.
They should be going to a program, yeah. So the judiciary and the judges have to be, educated on this subject.
Yeah.
How to treat addicts and alcoholics.
That's so true because, you arrest an addict and you throw them in jail with like hardened criminals and you're ensuring that they will remain addicts for life.
Yeah.
There's no hope of recovery.
Yeah.
So, we have miles to go before we sleep.
Miles to go. What is happening now around the world is that regression. And leaders are activating that reptilian brain, which is dormant in us. And hate is being propelled.
Yes.
It is being done all over the world. I think it was Plato who said, the world will be at peace only when it is ruled by poets and philosophers. Because poets and philosophers activate that higher consciousness.
Yes.
Who live on that other conscious plane.
Yes.
And if they rule the world in every country, will the world rise?
Yes. You have even more responsibility when you are an artist today. Because how do you hold on to humanity in a world that is just so full of hate? At every point you're being told to kind of suspect the other, hate the other. They're driving home this feeling in you that, oh my God, Denzel's going to take my morsel of food away from me.
Yeah.
So he needs to go. What I loved about the Hindi film industry is nobody ever considered what your surname was.
Never.
An actor was signed because an actor was going to be right for that film and an actor was a star, and that was enough. But for the first time, I see division within my own film industry where there is a clear line and people leaning right or left or worse, according to me, are the ones who sit right in the center.
And it's most unfortunate that it has come into the most liberal of industries, which was, it may have existed in other areas, yeah, but never in the film industry in India, yeah.
Yeah, you were talking about Javed and you were talking about Jagdeep ji earlier, and I remember Javed telling me, he says, my father used to tell me, he says कि हिंदी फिल्मों का काम ये है कि हम आग बुझाएं, we put the fires off.
Yeah, yeah.
Movies like Amar Akbar Anthony, where we spoke about Anthony Gonzalez.
Absolutely.
That is the India that I was born to, and in my head and heart will die in, because I think that's what makes us so unique.
It's very sad to see what's going on, and I fear for this country, which I love very much. I am not a rabid nationalist, although at some times I believe that nationalism is is another disease.
Yes.
It constricts you from a larger vision, from a larger consciousness of the world and humanity.
You went to Canada for a short stint and you couldn't...
I never intended to leave the country, but the riots had happened and,
yes,
that scared the shit out of me. I had never seen Bombay
burn.
And
sad, yes.
And even if it did, it never touched Bandra.
Yeah.
But this time it did. It came almost home.
Yeah.
And I remember walking back late at night where I didn't see not even a rat on the road or a dog at the time of curfew. And that's really scared me. I had this option of going abroad and I took it. And I went there and I lived there for some time. I said, no, I got to go back. This is my home.
This is our home.
Yeah. This is the land I lived in all my life, and I love it.
Yeah.
And I came back.
But talking about Canada, you're married to glorious Carissa, who's Canadian and is a whiskey connoisseur amongst other really fine things. And you have such a unique relationship, the two of you. What's it like living in a home where you've got these glorious bottles of malt stacked almost up to the ceiling? I remember walking into your home once and saying, Denzel, why didn't you meet Carissa in our glory days when I would be drinking whiskey so we could imbibe? But she's one of those people who has these whiskey tastings and drinks literally 5 ml.
She is
and can stop.
She's a genius at it. She's a connoisseur.
Yeah.
She knows her malts by the back of her toenail.
Yes.
And appreciates them, and actually is academic about it, you
Yes.
know. But she's not an alcoholic, and she can just taste, and, you know, she enjoys doing it. She has these whiskey tastings and all. But I keep away, and she respects that I do not drink.
But I think that's what I see with the two of you. There is palpable mutual respect.
We are companions. We are friends. Yeah.
And when are you going to make that movie on Bandra that you always speak about?
Oh, that's still in process.
That captures the soul of the Bandra that we knew and love.
Yeah. What man? Where? How you man, Pooja? How you? Where man? You know, that this dialect.
This dialect is unique.
And before it vanishes,
We need to capture it.
we need to capture it, yeah.
And I see bungalows disappear. It's like a part of my soul is being,
Yeah.
erased forever.
What you're saying, exactly.
And very soon, none of it will be around. But then those relics of people
Yeah.
and that mindset will remain in little nooks and crannies of the neighborhood. And we got to keep it alive.
Yeah.
But before we move on, I wanted to ask you, you played Nehru
Right.
and you played Jinnah. What was more difficult to play? And who did you enjoy playing more?
See, Nehru has a lot. Yeah. There's a lot of material, etc., footage, everything in India. You know, Nehru was, when I did it with Vijaya Mehta, who directed the play, Letters to a Daughter from Prison, she gave me access to Films Division. I was in
And to all of their archives.
And all of their archives.
Oh, wow.
2-3 days I sat in Films Division at Pedder Road in that auditorium alone and saw all the footage they had shot on Nehru.
Oh.
Yeah, that was fabulous. Then she introduced me to people who knew Nehru. Nehru had 28, I think, secretaries, one of whom I met.
Okay.
And learned some,
Interesting
details about his life. Whereas Jinnah has been demonized in this country. Now, Jinnah and Nehru are very similar, actually. If you look at their backgrounds, both of them came from wealthy families, both educated in London, both went to the bar. Yeah, both brilliant. But Jinnah, most of it is demonized history that we have here. So I had to delve more into Jinnah from all aspects to learn him in a balanced way.
Right.
Yeah. If I have to play him, I have to be convinced
Correct.
that he was doing right.
Correct.
Yeah, so I have to see all his points of view. So I found Jinnah far more interesting to do. And there's very little footage of him here in India at this point. He had a different mind, and everybody blames him for the partition. And in fact, they blame Nehru, they blame Gandhi.
Yeah, I was
Now,
about to
let's
say
not
that if
get
you're talking
into
about
that.
demonizing, I think Nehru is pretty much, he's demonized far more than Jinnah is at this point in our country, but that's a whole different
Yes,
episode.
absolutely. My dear Indu, never do anything in secret or anything that you would wish to hide. For the desire to hide anything means that you are afraid. And fear is a bad thing and unworthy of you.
Love that.
What a beautiful line.
That's stunning. So fear is a bad thing and absolutely unworthy of us. So we will recover not in the shadows but openly.
Absolutely.
We will hold our frailties to light.
Yeah.
We will show our scars to each other and to the world and say, hey, we've survived that too.
Yes.
And we will continue to potter around in our gardens.
Yeah.
And we will continue to create and believe and recite poetry to each other in a crumbling world and walk through Bandra on occasion and recount the stories and the people who hung out of balconies.
Absolutely.
And we shall leave the world in a slightly better condition than we found it. I must say that you did something amazing. You brought the first post box to our little Adivasi village. Through your good offices with the Postmaster General. And I'm so grateful to you for that. So you've already left the world in a better place, Denzel.
Nothing.
And you've contributed to my life and you've made it richer.
What an emotional help you've been to me. I come to you very often to cry, and
I need to hold your hand for that. I'm
and you always have given me the best counsel I could ever have. Yeah.
Who would have thought?
Yeah.
Wow. But thank you. And thank you for trusting me.
We all feel defeated at some point
as long
in
as
our
we can
life.
pick each
and
other
as
up,
long
we're
as we
good.
have friends and good people whom we trust.
Yes.
Life is beautiful. Thank you, Pooja.
And thank you. But before you go, we have a segment where we flip the table. Is there anything you want to ask me, though? Please do.
So, Pooja, you have this amazing sense of space, of design, and putting things together, really. Where does this come from? What were your influences?
I think my mother, she had this amazing capacity to really stretch a rupee. And she would make curtains out of saris. And, she loved color everywhere. So I think being able to create beauty from nothing is what I learned from her. That you don't need a lot of money.
Exactly.
And you don't need a large budget to make a room seem comforting and home-like.
Exactly.
So I learned that from her. And for some strange reason, when I was 19, 20, I used to spend all my money on buying Architectural Digest. And in those days, it cost a lot of money. And I still have them all saved from the 90s.
But what an aesthetic you have. Not only externally, but also inside.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you for doing this and sitting down with me.
Thank you, darling.
We can talk about lots of things, Denzel, forever. But before I go, I think you have an alternate career. I think the Denzel Smith tour of Bandra.
Retirement plan.
It has to be done.
Retirement plan.
Maybe we can do a documentary on that. Yeah. So thank you, my friend.
Thank you.
And see you in the country soon enough.
Thank you. Thank you, Pooja.
Love you. The Pooja Bhatt Show is produced by Mammoth Media Asia and Epilogue Entertainment and distributed by iHeart Podcasts. The executive producer is Jonathan Strickland.